Hello and welcome to the webinar. My name is John. I am a former Thinkful student and now webinar host. Now let's get started. So for you guys that don't know Thinkful, it's basically an online program where you could learn about technology, things like that. The way that we do this is basically two really key features, I guess three even. The first is the one-on-one mentorship. So the big thing here is that when you are learning about different topics, like for example, in this case, UX, you would be paired with a senior designer. So while you learn stuff maybe on your own or with other classmates or other like people that you're working on projects with, you will get that one-on-one support from some senior developer, or not developer. I was thinking of the JavaScript course. Some senior designer who can basically walk you through the ropes, like what are you having trouble with, all that kind of stuff. And that's pretty flexible because it is based off of your schedule as well as his or hers. So, it's definitely, accommodating to you. And that's what, it's a really good way to study, I believe, having that one-on-one mentorship. The other thing is the project-based learning. So basically when you are applying for jobs, obviously, you definitely need your resume, your CV, but you also need to have something to present. So some sort of portfolio, in this case, like a portfolio. There's also like the GitHub for the more developer friendly folk. So what we do at Thinkful is basically start maybe you have an empty portfolio. When I started Thinkful, I was a former student back in 2017. I had no sort of portfolio. I had no sort of anything. And I basically had to start from scratch. And when I was ready to apply for jobs, I had a few things in my portfolio already. So I was able to basically come in as if I had that real world experience, when in reality, I was basically just, using the course as my experience. So that's going to be important. You need those kinds of things if you want to be, taken seriously in an interview or whatever it is. So those are two really key things that I feel are Thinkful's bread and butter. And the last thing, the icing on the cake, is basically the guarantee. So what this means is that if you do not receive a job after 6 months of finishing the Thinkful course, then we give you your money back. This is kind of a testament to how seriously we take this. We definitely, we have a career services team who definitely works very hard. Their entire job is to get you guys jobs. So this is, you could tell that this is pretty bold and pretty large font here compared to the rest of the text. Like, this is really what we strive for. This is our mission, to get you guys jobs. All right. So if you guys have any other questions about Thinkful, I will be glad to answer you guys. But if not, then I will move forward. And we are basically going to start with the beginning. It looks like you guys, some of you guys are, starting out from the beginning, have no experience in UX. That's totally fine. I think that UX is definitely one of those careers where it doesn't really matter what you study. I've known UX people that have studied architecture, that have studied graphic design, that have studied psychology. I actually studied journalism. So I come from like a writing background, and that actually works pretty well with UX, because UX is a lot of taking notes on people and figuring out what people like and on all that kind of stuff. So I think that that's a good thing. Like, wherever you are coming from, it is really a good starting point for UX, as long as you use your strengths for it. And this is basically just, a quick quote. UX is the totality of end users' perceptions as they interact with a product or service. These perceptions include effectiveness, efficiency, emotional satisfaction, and the quality of the relationship with the entity that created the product or service. All right, so this is, it's a hefty quote, I must admit. But what it's basically saying is that, whatever you're using, it could be, the latest, Apple product, like Apple TV or whatever it is. But it could also be something like a pen. UX is a relatively new term. I think the term was coined sometime in the 90s. So it's not too much of a new term. But user experience is something that has existed for thousands of years. There were cavemen testing out like fires and things like that, and maybe one of them was doing the fire better than the other. Like, that's all about user experience. User experience has nothing to really do about like computers and things, but it's more just appealing to the person using the product. So that's one real key point to get inside of your head. That when you are designing things, you're basically not designing for yourself, but you're designing for some particular user. All right. I'm loving all these introductions, by the way. Very cool. All right. All right. So this is a little bit more. So basically, the reason why this slide is in this deck, I think that's because UX user experience is kind of like a newly named thing. And now you see a lot of companies. I would definitely blame Apple. Apple really made made it kind of a point to make things beautiful. All of their products look really nice and all that kind of stuff. If you look at computers from the Microsoft days and before that, computers were ugly. Computers were hard to use. They were really only used by really smart, nerdy type of people. But now, I mean, a 7-year-old could use an iPod or an iPad or whatever it is. Like they're perfectly capable of using these products because Apple or Google, like all these companies were basically making it so that the end user would have an enjoyable experience. I think that a lot of other companies are following suit now. So that now you see, these big, the big four, the Apple, the Facebook, all those kinds of companies have done that. So now other companies that, come after those big four, the smaller size companies are definitely just following suit. They want beautiful products, basically. And because of this, what we have is kind of like a separation of UX and UI. A lot of times when you apply to jobs, you'll see UX and UI as if they're two completely different things. And in reality, they are very different things. I would actually say that UI is pretty much a subcategory of UX. I think that UX is more of kind of like the overarching topic. It's very broad. UX could mean a lot of different things, whereas UI is specifically that more graphical thing. It's more kind of like the poll that I had you guys take before. Like that is very UI centric. It's creating wireframes and all that kind of stuff. So just know that I think that this photo or this image right here kind of does a really good job with kind of analyzing the difference between the two. UX in user experience UX, you're going to be doing stuff like interviewing potential users or stakeholders and getting feedback, testing things. It's very analytical. It's very psychological. It's kind of appealing to these kinds of users that you may have and seeing what they like and what they don't like. UI, on the other hand, is all about I think colors is a really good example of UI. Like you want to kind of use the brand colors and things like that, so people like remember you and that sort of thing. You want to kind of like have your buttons as big as possible or as small as possible or in the right place. UI is all about things that you see, or maybe not even see. It could be like a voice UI sort of thing, like an Alexa or a Siri or something like that. But that is basically the difference between the two. UI is a lot more of things that you see and like a lot of front end developments kind of falls in the UI category, whereas UX is a little bit more broad and it's more concerned about is the user having an enjoyable experience regardless of how the product works. All right. And this is very psychological. A lot of things appeal to people's emotions. I mean, you guys were probably watching the Super Bowl last night, and a lot of the commercials were tugging at your heartstrings and things like that. They want that emotional response from you. I think that's a very important thing to do. And I think that is what UX is all about. It's kind of trying to appeal to someone, some kind of user, to use a product in a certain way and enjoy using that product. And commercials kind of falls into that. It's more advertising than anything, but I think it does have an element of UX for sure. All right, so now we come to this slide here. All right, so if you were to search UX design, process, you're going to get a lot of different examples of what is the process to kind of create a product or create some sort of experience. And to be honest, there's not really one product. There's not really one sort of process. I think that a lot of what I like is more of a user-centered design. I'll type that in the chat, user-centered design. You could totally look that up later if you are interested. But it's basically, it has elements of what's on the screen here as well. But basically what you are doing is, looking into what users like and trying to figure out a way to appeal to them that way. What we have on the screen here is basically, that's similar sort of process. The first thing that you want to do is research. You want to research the people that you want that are going to eventually use the product. And once you do that research, you define a problem. Is there a problem in why is it that they are unable to use your application or whatever it is, or how are you planning to get more users for your application? So defining the problem is a really good way to kind of get everybody on the same page. If you have a team of designers, for example, and maybe half of the team thinks that the problem is one thing and the other half thinks that the problem is another thing, then you're going to have a hard time, really conquering that problem, because in reality, people think that there are multiple problems. Same thing here. The Ideate phase is basically all about brainstorming and figuring out, what is your method of attack? How are you going to, figure out this problem? Then this half, I would say this half here is more of that UI. This is where UI comes in. You're creating prototypes, wireframes, different sorts of graphical things. You're going back to those same people that you researched and you're trying to test these things. So this is where like A/B testing comes in, for example, and then you're implementing. And all of this stuff, it doesn't really happen sequentially, because, for example, you're always going to be testing. Testing is happening, as soon as the first step. It's just basically, each step flows into one another, but each step is also continuous. So I don't like this linear sort of way that this is presented, because I think that all of these things kind of have to continue to happen, like at all times, basically. You're always defining the user, for example. All right, and this is just another good quote. UX design is the process of researching users to understand them better, to enhance their satisfaction of a product or experience. Very cool. All right, and this is just one more example of well, actually, the fact that it's a Venn diagram is actually really awesome for me, because honestly, like, user experience is all about diagrams and just creating some visual representation of something else. So what we have here is a Venn diagram that kind of explains the difference and the similarities between UX and UI. So this is, just basically what I was saying before, how UX is more about researching. You have your user research, you have your testing. It's about personas. A user persona is basically when you kind of create a profile for a user, and you kind of create that ideal person that you're trying to look for. This could be something like, you're looking for the 32-year-old mom, soccer mom who drives a minivan or something like that. Like, that would be an example of a persona. All right. So you can see that UX is a little bit more about research and more analytics, whereas UI is definitely more about that visual element. There's a lot of colors, branding, typography. All this stuff kind of has to do with more graphical stuff. You will see that there are overlaps even within these circles. Like, for example, you see low fidelity here and you see high fidelity here. These refer to wireframing. A low fidelity wireframe is like basically when you take a napkin and you draw what an app looks like. It's a very quick sketch of what a product could look like. It's not really in detail. However, when we get to the high fidelity, this is when we get to the things like Sketch and Figma, these programs that can really create very beautiful things, and you really have to have like pinpoint accuracy of the colors and all this other kinds of good stuff. So yeah, just keep uh, an eye out for that those sorts of things, because these are very important. Um, Also, I think that I would add case studies to UX as well, because if actually, I have a question for you guys in the chat. If How many of you guys have ever done a case study or know what a case study is in terms of UX? All right, so we're talking about case studies. Who has done a case study or know what a case study is, or even if you have no idea what the case study is, because case studies are extremely important in terms of UX, especially for job seekers. We will look at case studies in a little bit, and case studies are basically it's similar to other industries, but for UX specifically, it is pretty important. Okay, so you guys are looks like you guys are pretty aware of them. Okay, awesome. Very cool. All right, so I don't know if any of you guys are okay. All right, so you guys have experience with other types of case studies. That's good, because case studies in UX are no different. There's a different structure for sure, I would say, but it's kind of the same sort of elements that go into it. All right, so this slide is basically about the changing job of UX and UI versus developers. Because UX is such a new field, a lot of times when you see UX developer or UX designer or UI designer, a lot of them get grouped in with developer jobs. And honestly, I'm not really sure how I feel about this. I think that's a lot of smaller companies aren't able to hire as many people. So they might want to just hire someone that can be a designer, but then also do web development. I don't know if you guys know JavaScript or Python or any of those other languages, but I think that the bigger company that you do go to. Okay, we do have a question. Okay, so we have a question. The question is, what do you mean by some front end JavaScript, or does that include other languages? Yes. So basically, what this is saying, this front end part here, it's usually JavaScript if you are working on a web application. So I would say that good designers, are aware of HTML and CSS for sure, like any sorts of like how to use them. Maybe there's this new thing called Webflow, which is kind of interesting, and it does touch on HTML and CSS as from a design standpoint. But a lot of times when you have a smaller company, especially, you see that UX jobs and UI jobs are actually grouped in with developers. So instead of seeing jobs for the UX designer, you'll actually see something called a UX engineer. And what that means is that they want you doing JavaScript in addition to the case studies and all that stuff that we were talking about before. Now, I don't know how I feel about this. I think that this is what's known as the unicorn. I think that the bigger company that you go to, the less likely that this would happen. But if you are going for like startups, for example, startups may have a very small engineering team. So knowing both UX and some sort of JavaScript, maybe just be familiar with JavaScript. You don't even have to be like a pro or anything like that. I think that is an additional skill that you could learn. I'm not sure how well you guys know these types of coding languages, so it's definitely not mandatory. But I just wanted to let you guys know that this, if you are interested, this would only help your chances to succeed as a UX person. All right. All right. So, yeah, that was just a quick overview of what a UX is and kind of like the state of the union with, in terms of how it fits together with, the coding languages and things like that. I think that designers by nature probably don't want to code because that should be left to developers, and rightfully so. I think that even to kind of include design in the engineering department is actually kind of weird to me. I think that design really should be left alone. It shouldn't be with marketing. It shouldn't be with engineering. I think that it should really just be its own thing. But some companies are too small to do that, and they don't see the value of UX. So what we're going to talk about in this section is UX in the business setting. Like what makes UX basically that important that it really deserves to be talked about as its own sort of department, basically. All right, so we have one more Venn diagram, which is really cool. Although this one has 3 circles. I'm not sure if this is still a Venn diagram, but I would assume so. I don't think there's another name for this. But basically, what we have here, the first thing I want to do is point out the top 2, just the top 2. We could ignore the orange circle for now. But what we already talked about prior to this slide is that the most important thing for user experience is it's all about the user, right? The things that you design are not for you; they're for the person that's going to use the product. So maybe that person is similar to you, but at the same time, you could also be designing a product that is extremely different from you. Like maybe you're designing a product for someone who is 20 years older, maybe another gender, like whatever it is. Like it could be a product for someone completely different from you. Maybe it's a children's app or something like that. So you always have to be aware of who the user is when you're designing. Now, this is the case, but then we also have to realize that this is the real world. So the people that are going to be paying you the big bucks to design this thing also need a reason to be creating this project in the first place. That's where the business goals come in. I think a good example of these two would be that when you go to YouTube, for example, it is a really great user experience because you're able to watch whatever video you want. You could find a playlist, you could do all this good stuff, you could watch whatever video you want. The trade-off for that is that sometimes you come across a video and you have to watch a little bit of an ad. That ad, it is a little bit annoying, but because the user experience is so good, we tend not to care. We sit through the 5-second or 10 seconds of like the mandatory waiting time, and then immediately we just skip through the ad. Now, to the user, that's very annoying, but to YouTube.com, this is their business goal. This is how the money is being generated. For the people that are creating content on YouTube, this is how they're making money as well, because they're getting advertisements and things like that. So YouTube is actually a really good example of this sort of like union between these two. So a lot of times that you do see, what is user design, you will see that these two do form a Venn diagram. Then there's the more accurate version, which is the one that includes this bottom section here. So YouTube's obviously been around for a while. It obviously has a lot of people working for it, and they're able to do a lot of things in a short amount of time. However, there are other companies, and other companies may not have the money. They may not have the staff. They may not have the time to do things. Like for example, if you are put on a project that has to be done by the end of the week, and it's a project that really should take 3 months, you're not going to really do a good job. You're probably going to rush some things, and it wouldn't really be so much of a good product compared to how well it would be if you had extra time or extra manpower or extra money, whatever it is. So that's why this is a really important circle as well. You need the technical constraints to kind of express that this is, we don't work in a vacuum. We work with deadlines. We work with all sorts of things that kind of prevent us from creating the perfect product or the perfect experience. But as long as all 3 of these things are kind of balanced together, that's where we get that beautiful UX design. All right. So this is a very simple slide, but I think it's probably one of the most important ones that you're going to see, because I think that whenever you are considering something that is being designed, this is what has to be taken into account. Is it meeting the user's needs, but also the business needs? And is it something that can be realistically done, basically, based off of technical constraints? All right. Awesome. Cool, guys. All right, we'll move forward. All right, so now we have the point of view statement. All right, so this fits nicely with the last slide with the business goals and things like that. This is basically, what you want to kind of accomplish in terms of, meeting the user goals, but also the business goals. And I think in the actual slides in the notes section, there is an example. For example, if you have a banking site, for example, a site that is kind of taking care of your money, for example, I think that this is a really good example. The X would basically be a financial site or a banking site. Let's say Wells Fargo or Chase, let's say. And we could say something like Chase needs to have a two-button verification on its application because it would make the app seem safer to use. All right, so that's basically how these all go together. Who is the client, or who are you building this thing for, and what do they need and why? That's basically all this is saying. There is another example. Yeah, so basically think of something like Netflix, how you are able to watch things at your own pace. Some people binge, but some people just watch 10 minutes a day. So if you consider like the busy single mom who likes sci-fi movies, this busy single mom, she needs a way to access new entertainment in a way that she could consume it at her own pace. So enter Netflix. That's how to do that kind of thing. All right, awesome. All right, so this is the fun part here. All right, we have a question. When will outcomes data for the UX UI design be available? I'm not really sure. Let me clarify your question a little bit because I'm not really sure what you mean. All right, I'm gonna move ahead to the job section now. And guys, anytime that you want to stop me and ask about a job, that's totally fine. The thing about this section is that a lot of times jobs at one company can actually be completely different at another. This is especially true for UX design just because a lot of people don't really know how to name these jobs. Oh, I see. Okay. All right. The outcomes page. I think that might be quarterly. I'm not exactly sure. Let me check that for you a little bit later on during the question section. But I think it might be, it's either quarterly or biannually or annually, something like that. All right, so that's about the outcomes. All right, so let's talk about jobs. The first thing you're going to find is the user researcher. Now this one goes first. These are basically put chronologically. So this slide and the one next to it. The UX researcher is probably the farthest that you could get from someone that handles Adobe Photoshop and Sketch and all those kinds of things. The user researcher may be the person that is studying psychology. It may be the person that just likes to write and take notes. That really likes to interview people. I think that journalism, like a journalism background, actually helps a lot here to get research on people. I was in a project before where it was basically like an education application, so I had to talk to a lot of teachers and things like that, and it was kind of interesting because I guess what's you, the person that's designing the app, you think that certain things are very easy about the application, but then you ask certain people about the application and they give you a completely different answer or notice things that you don't notice. So user researcher is all about really getting into that other person's shoes and really just clicking around as that person, seeing if you could kind of identify how the app works and things like that. The content strategist, however, this person is more, as you could see from the strategist part, like this person is more business focused. It's sort of combining the actual research that was done with basically what the business goals are. The user goals, yes, of course, but I think this one has an emphasis a little bit more on the business side. So this person may be working with marketing as well. This person can have like a business background or whatever it is. So I have seen content strategist this way. I've also seen a content strategist sort of work as a content writer, or otherwise known as a UX writer. The UX writer is sort of like a copywriter, but a little more intuitive, I would say. Copywriter is more just writing words, but a UX writer is writing the right words. And they may be doing testing and things like that as well. So that's what that is. Visual designer is pretty straightforward. It's exactly what it sounds like. It is the person that is posting things on Behance and Dribbble. Although, those things, those types of sites may be just a little bit more pretty than need be. But the visual designer is all about, those programs that we mentioned before, the Adobes and all that stuff. All right, so Adrian has a question, very good question. Are these all examples of entry-level jobs, or are these in order of seniority? Good question. And these have nothing to do with seniority at all. So for example, you may have like a junior user researcher, but you could also have a senior user researcher. So all of these, have nothing to do with seniority. However, yeah, you could probably find each of these as entry level jobs, but then also senior level jobs. These are basically grouped by the different. Actually, I'm going to go back to a slide here. If I were to go back to this slide, I think this kind of explains the jobs a little bit better, because a visual designer is more the person that's working here, where the prototype is, whereas the user researcher is obviously going to be in the research section, right? So I think that the differences in the jobs is not so much the seniority, but it's more where in the process that they are. Now, we mentioned before that if you have a smaller company, there may just be like one UX designer who's doing all of this stuff, and that is possible. However, if you have a bigger company, you may have a group of user researchers versus a group of visual designers. So that's kind of like where the difference is. It's basically in the different stages of the process. All right. Okay, so we'll talk about these. Let's see. So we have two more questions. So let me answer these. When people say visual designer, are they just referring to UI, or does it include graphic design as well? Good question. And yes, it can include graphic design. So yeah, graphic designer and UI designer, those two jobs actually do overlap sometimes. I think that UI designer tends to be a little bit more of someone that's designing like a website, for example, whereas graphic design may be, just someone that's designing like an image or of some sort. But the two of them do interlap, kind of like cross as well, for sure. Okay, so Nicole has a question. What are the names of the software? You mentioned Drupal. Okay. Yeah, it looks like that was answered. Yeah, so it's actually there's three B's. It's dribble.com, and another one is behance.net. I actually like Behance a little bit better. They're basically just websites where you can kind of post things. There's a slide a little bit later that we could actually look at them. But yeah, so they're just kind of that stuff. All right, so we have one more question from Allison. With a background in IT support, which do you think is the best or easiest UX UI job to transition to? Really good question. And I think, so if I kind of understand this, IT support is basically, you're doing a lot of fixing bugs and things like that in code. And I'm actually going to go back to my favorite slide right now before I continue. Basically, this implement section is kind of like the end of the design process. But from here, this is when the design is actually passed to developers. So a lot of times, developers and designers don't really speak the same language. So for someone to kind of understand code, that's really key. I think that's where my strengths are as well, because I actually did web development before I got into design. And because now I'm able to speak to developers and kind of understands, that they're using this library and things like that, it actually helps me as a designer because I don't create things that they are unable to create. They're unable to build or whatever it is. So I think that being somewhere here might be good for you, Allison. depending on, if you want to do something that's graphically based, or if you want to do something that's research based. I mean, like that's perfectly fine too. But I think that really the IT support really speaks to the fact that you are able to speak to developers, and you're able to kind of like, work with developers in a way that someone that doesn't have that kind of experience can. So really play up those strengths, and whatever job that you do kind of decide fits you. Um, you may like one of the programs that you use or whatever it is, then stick to that, but use that story. I think that UX design is all about telling the right story. And, if you come from that background, that's really what you have to do. This is probably also another good one for you as well. This is the one that I mentioned before, the UX UI developer. This is more of a newer role, but I do see it popping up quite a bit now. And it's basically you are a UX designer plus a developer of sorts. So you may be using JavaScript usually, or maybe some other coding language possibly. But usually JavaScript, because that is the language of the web. All right. And the last distinction that I want to make with these jobs is that these two here. UX designer and product designer are very, very similar. And I think that a lot of companies use them interchangeably. I think that a lot of times when you see a product designer role, it's the same exact thing as what would be a UX designer, except the company that you're applying for is selling a product of some sort. So for example, if you were applying to Facebook, the Facebook platform is the product. So I wouldn't be surprised if you go to Facebook and you look for UX designer and you don't find it. Maybe they have a product designer instead. I actually don't know that for a fact, but they probably have UX designer, but I don't really know. But that's kind of like my understanding of the difference between the two. I think that's in a lot of cases they are a very similar job, and it's just different wording. And to be completely honest with you. All right, sounds good. Okay, so those are a lot of jobs. We have plenty of jobs. These are not the only jobs. I think there are way more jobs than just this, but these are just some of them. All right, so we have a question. Do product designers need visual design, graphic design skills? I think that it would help. I think that that is something that would help to have those kinds of skills. I don't think that it would hurt. I think that I'm actually going to go to this page here. This is a website. I'm going to actually post it in. It's just called Laws of UX. And I think that, graphic design and product design, all those things are good. But I think that stuff like this is a little bit more important. So for example, stuff like this, this is talking about how big a button is. Let me see if I can get a good one here. Let's see what we could do. These are basically just UX laws. For example, like there's no, yeah, so something like this. This circle is the most likely to be remembered because it's so different from the rest. This is the stuff that you have to realize when you're designing a website, for example. So graphic design comes in handy with stuff like this because, when you're creating some sort of graphic, for example, if you're creating a poster, let's say, you want to create, certain elements of that poster more recognizable than others. You want to use specific colors, maybe you want to use specific sizes for things. So it definitely kind of like lends itself to all that sort of stuff. All right, so we have another question. Are all of these jobs listed on the second slide more higher level and require more experience than the first few mentioned? No, these three and these three are not different like that. It's just I couldn't fit all of them on one slide, so I just continued them on the next slide. But again, I think that this is basically the difference between this slide and the next is that this one is basically starting with the research and then moving into design. This one kind of gets into like the development stage. So this is a little bit later in the process, I would say. But there's no difference in seniority or anything like that. All right, so Adrian has a question. When looking at master's programs for UX design or human-computer interaction, what classes should I be looking for to know it's a serious program? It's HCI and UX design the same thing or different? Um, that's a really good question. I think that's human computer interaction is I think the best way to answer that is that UX or user experience can be a lot of different things. It doesn't have to involve a computer. For example, the thing that I like to use is that now in the past 3 or 4 years, however many it was, you're seeing a lot more you're seeing a lot more of these personal assistant applications. Like the OK Google and the Amazon Alexa, like all those sorts of products. They don't have any sort of like screen that you can interact with, so it's not really like a computer interaction sort of thing. But it is a platform. It is a computer platform that you are interacting with. So it's less visual, but it's more audio. Someone's designing the voice, for example, and that sort of thing. So I think that when I talk about UX design versus human computer interaction, I think human computer interaction can be those sorts of audio things, but I think human computer interaction has more to do with, you know, on my screen, like what is this website trying to do? Like, is it trying to get me to buy something? All that kind of stuff. UX design, however, it's more broad. UX design is probably the broadest term in tech, I would say, because it's not very specific at all. You could have one UX designer who never touches any sort of Adobe product, and then there's another UX designer who's more like a graphic designer. Like I know someone was mentioning like graphic design before. It's a little bit more broad, whereas human computer interaction sounds a little bit more specific. In terms of which classes you should take, um, that's hard for me to say because I don't know what the class catalog looks like or anything like that. But I would basically just say, you want to basically just learn how to build products, and you want to learn how to kind of like research users. You want to understand users. So I think that classes that kind of focus on the psychology of people, maybe they're psychological or even like sociology. I think that classes that also do a bit of some sort of graphical design sort of thing would be good. So learning programs like Sketch and those sorts of things that could definitely help for sure. So I think that it might be serious, it might not. I don't really know. If you want, you can definitely like shoot me an email or whatever it is. I'll give you guys my LinkedIn later so you could connect with me. And I could definitely take a look at it and see what I think of it. Actually, I'll do that right now. All right. So there's my LinkedIn. If any of you guys want to connect with me, you totally can. I can answer any other questions there. But we have 45 more minutes anyway, so feel free to ask them here if you would like. The next section that we're going to go into is pretty much the tools that we're going to use. So this is going to be more of that graphical stuff. We'll look at a few programs that we could use and also a few websites that I really like. And yeah, it should be good. All right. So the first thing here is, as you can see, that this is something that more of a user research would use. This is what's called a flowchart, or there's also such thing as like a user map or a journey map. There's a lot of different names for these types of things. But basically what we see is, we see a familiar website on the right side, and what this chart here is doing, it's a very simple chart, but it's basically just showing you how to log into something. Right, we have the start button here. We're entering a website or going to a URL here, and we're getting to the web page, and we're trying to sign in with our user ID and a password. So all this is basically saying is that it's a flow chart. Like, are we entering the right password? If so, let's go this way. If not, then loop it around. So this is the kind of things. This is like one of the types of things that a user experienced person would have to consider. They would have to consider each screen. They would have to consider like kind of going from one place to another. Like, is it a good transition? Does it make sense? Like, I know that I've been to several websites in my life that I've just hated, just because I didn't know how to find anything, or there wasn't like an obvious sort of button that kind of like lit the way to tell me what to do. And a lot of times users really want to be told what to do. They want their experience. They don't want to work for their experience, basically. All right. All right, awesome. Yeah, send the connections my way. No worries. And you could send whatever questions that you have in a private message or whatever it is. That's perfectly fine. I always like to help. All right, so these are a little bit more of tools. I left some links here. This is an example of a low fidelity wireframe in the picture. It's basically a guy he's basically drawing what the buttons look like, what the image looks like. It looks like this is some sort of video screen. You can see that there's a little play button here. There may be a little playlist down here. But basically that's what a wireframe is. You want to create a wireframe that could kind of show what this design looks like. These are all mobile sketches. So this is obviously the person that's developing a mobile application. But wireframes could also be for a web application or some other sort of thing. I did leave a link here to just a wireframe product, wireframe.cc, and it's basically just a free way to create wireframes. So for example, it looks like a graphing paper. I can kind of create a square, and you could see that I could create some text. They give you some lorem ipsum text, and you could basically see that there's not really a lot that you could do. It's basically making boxes and circles, but you can kind of imagine that. Actually, it kind of looks like I made an iPod, the original iPod with the wheel. So there you go. I made a nice little wireframe there. But you can just imagine that this is all you basically need for creating a product, right? You just need a couple shapes. You could add an image, you could add some text, and that's basically it, right? So this is a very simple way to create very basic wireframes. All right, mockups and prototypes are also key things to learn. This is a special mention, mobbin.design, and I would definitely recommend going to this site because basically what Mobbin Design is they just have a bunch of applications. Like for example, this is the Airbnb mobile application, and all they do is basically just give you all the screens. They give you every single screen from the Airbnb mobile app. Obviously Twitch is here too, Cocoon, like Honey, like all of these different types of things. But basically you could just see every single screen. So for example, let's click on Shake Shack for all my East Coast people, although I think it's not just on the East Coast anymore. And you could basically just see all of the different screens. Like these are all the different things that have to go into design. Each of these screens was carefully thought out by designers, like a design team, and to try to make people to do certain things. You could see that there is like all of the buttons are this same green color. It looks like they're consistently at the same spot on the screen. The green matches the check mark here when they click to add stuff or whatever it is. And you can see it's perfectly on brand too, because that is the green from Shake Shack. So this is definitely just a really good website with just kind of just seeing what mobile applications do. For example, if in your portfolio maybe you want to create a made up fast food joint, it might make sense to look at Shake Shack and kind of get ideas, or maybe look at other fast food mobile applications like McDonald's or whatever it is to kind of get ideas. What's the phrase, good artists or great artists steal or something like that? I think that the same goes true for designers. You always want to get inspiration from other people's design to create really good things yourself. All right. Okay, so these are the four of the major design tools these days. I saw that many of you guys have voted in the polls for which ones you have used. A lot of you guys have said none. That's totally fine. But these are not the only ones either. But these are basically how you're going to make more high fidelity wireframes and prototypes. So we have Sketch here, we have Figma, Adobe XD, and InVision Studio. A little bit about each of these. Sketch is primarily a Mac application. I think it only works on Mac. There is a one-time fee, I believe. I think it's either $50 or $100. I forgot. But it is a really good tool. It does everything that you need to. Figma is kind of like the new guy on the block. It's only a couple years old, and it actually runs in the browser, which is actually pretty useful. Figma is my favorite of these four by far. Also, one really good thing about Figma is that it's free. And actually, another good thing about Figma is that you can collaborate with other people. So similar to how if you go to a Google Doc and there's another person on the same Google Doc, you guys could work together. The same goes true for Figma. You guys can both work at the same time on one product, which is cool. Adobe XD obviously comes from a line of Adobe products. So this, in conjunction with stuff like Adobe Illustrator and Adobe Photoshop, Adobe XD, you can't go wrong with Adobe. It's a subscription-based fee. So if you have an Adobe membership, it's however much it is, but you have to pay basically every month or every year or so. And the last one's InVision. This one is really good for like animations, I would say. And I would say InVision is another really good one. It's also free, I believe. So I think that this is definitely a good one to check out as well. And I put some links here as well if you guys want to check out the downloads and that sort of thing. We will look at what kind of stuff that you could build with this stuff. But I think the key here about these four is I don't think that you guys should get worked up about, oh, do I have to learn all four, or do I have to choose the right one? I think that that's kind of a silly way to look at it because, to be honest with you, every one of these four and every other thing that we'll look at, for example, Zeppelin is a good one, Zeplin. All of those things can do certain things. Some products can do things better. Like, for example, I mentioned Figma has that collaboration tool. InVision has sort of like an animation strength. I think that each of the product has one thing or two things about it that kind of makes it stand out. But at the end of the day, all you really want to do is create squares, add text. And I think that each of these products can do that. So I think it's less about which product that you use and more about, if you use one product, can you learn another? I think that if you understand basic concepts about each of these, spacing, color, all those like laws of UX that we were looking at before, then you are able to kind of just proceed and move along and do the next thing. All right, so definitely keep that in mind. Also, a lot of times in job applications, you'll have people that ask, like on the job application, it says, must know Sketch, Figma, InVision, Adobe XD. It's like, yeah, all four? Okay, like why am I going to use all four? So just keep that in mind. All right, so we have a question here. So Nicole says, is it safe to say transitioning to a career in UX, UI is more seamless than a software engineering job because you don't have to learn coding? I think that there are still hurdles. I think that it's definitely not the easiest thing in the world to transition. I think getting that first job is always the hardest, right? Because I think that coding jobs, engineering jobs, and UX design jobs have a very similar barrier in that a lot of people, a lot of companies just don't want to hire juniors. And I'm not saying that to scare you guys, but a lot of times the mentality is that people don't want to hire juniors because they don't want to train them. And because, it costs money to train or whatever it is. But I think that's, and to be honest, that's something that you are going to, as a person transitioning, I think that you are going to have to, jump that hurdle anyway, because this is going to be your first UX design job anyway. I think that if you market yourself correctly, and you could kind of market yourself as someone that has the experience anyway, then you don't have to kind of be that junior. And you could kind of go into UX design as just a UX designer and not a junior UX designer, for example. I think that's Coding is definitely like coding is challenging. It's definitely like some people are very good at it. Some people definitely need more time with it. Um, but it is kind of like a skill to learn. I think that design is similar. It's maybe not as intense, but there are a lot of rules about design that make that really make or break you. We are going to look at a couple of case studies in a little bit, and we'll see how UX design is not so much about like creating things like in Sketch or whatever, but it's more just about telling a story. So I think that one of the best skills that you can have as a UX designer is basically a storyteller. And I think that that's more of a practical skill than knowing JavaScript for sure. So kind of to answer your question, I think that, yeah, it probably is easier to transition into this than engineering. But however, if you are a good storyteller, there might be someone that's working, just as hard to be a great storyteller. So I think that, it's easier to transition, but the competition is just as fierce. So, I think that the best way to look at it is just try to be the best that you can be, and that job will come to you for sure. All right, that was definitely a roundabout answer, but so please forgive me for that. So I guess like what we're looking at here is more of the psychological elements. There's a such thing as visual design, visual hierarchy. These are just basically just tips to make your designs better. And what we have here are not four, six different brands. I can't count. And these brands have stuff in common. What do you think that these six brands have in common? That is your question. What do the six brands on the left side have in common? All right, Adrian, you basically took the answer from me, but that is correct. Yes, the red color is basically associated with what's the word like rapid buying and things like that. Like people make decisions based off of emotion, all that kind of stuff. And a lot of food brands are going to have red because of that very reason. So obviously these are six brands. Obviously the red color doesn't exist in every food brand. I think we have like Subway, which is like yellow and green or whatever it is. But it is definitely a color that pops up a lot in food brands all the time. And it's an impulse. Yeah, impulse. That's the word I'm looking for. It's definitely like an impulse sort of reaction that you want to kind of instill in your user. Like this is, choosing these colors for those six brands is definitely a really good example of user experience because people are going to associate that red color with that sort of like impulse buying because they're hungry or whatever it is. Another thing is, especially McDonald's, like it's iconic. Like you see those yellow arches, like immediately you know what that is. I think that there are certain brands that have that sort of icon, that sort of that iconic symbolism that you could just see a symbol and understand what it is. I think Nike is another good one. Um, but yeah, I mean, like that is good design. It's good design to kind of like associate a particular symbol or a particular color with a particular feeling or like when I think of Nike, I think of like successful athletes and things like that. And all I have to see is just basically that swoosh logo. On the right side, we basically have Facebook. Obviously, there is the story that's Mark Zuckerberg is colorblind, so that's why he chose the blue color. But blue is also kind of like a calmer color, and a lot of Facebook is all about connecting the world. You see a lot of blue in the world. You see the water, you see the sky. It's things like that. So I think that has a lot to do with the blue color. However, I think that Facebook this page actually does a really good job with explaining what Facebook does in a very simple and quick way. It has basically their mission statement here. Facebook helps you connect and share with the people in your life. It gives kind of like a visual representation of that mission by basically just having these small little people, I guess, or not stick figures, but little people basically, and just showing that the people are connected throughout the world, which is really cool. Then we have, a registration page and a login. And then you'll notice that the sign up button is green. That's important as well. Green is not a Facebook color at all. Facebook's colors are blue and white. So having this green here and having these yellow people here, they're definitely trying to make these two things stand out from the blue and white. This is just another good example of that. We have, I think that's, I have done a lot of A/B testing in my life. So A/B testing is basically what you see here. Maybe half the people that are testing out a product get a red button versus the other half that get a green button. And then you basically analyze which button did better. That's basically just A/B testing. UX is all about testing to see if people are having a good experience. So this may be a good example of that. You'll notice that the continuous improvement here, it is a link, and it's going to lead to a story about the car industry, how a little historical lesson about how Japan and the US kind of figured continuous improvements in the car industry to kind of make users have a better experience, basically. So be sure to check that out. All right, and these are just other things here. So spacing, obviously, repetition, wait, call to action, A/B testing. All right, now we get to, okay, well, actually, before I do this, I do have a question. Is the use of color different depending on cultures? For example, user designers designing for a food brand in another country might want to choose colors other than red. And yes, that is absolutely correct. In fact, yeah, I definitely have a personal story about that. I used to, I work in the US, but I used to work for a French company, and the French company had yellow as their color. And a lot of times in French culture, apparently yellow is associated with like adultery or some weird stuff, which isn't the case in the US. So when I heard that, and that the company was kind of like associated with those sorts of things, I found it a little confusing because that wasn't really the case in the US. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Like colors, for example, may mean different things to different cultures. Some cultures, yellow is more of like the happiness color. Like in the US, we associate yellow with the sun and things that are happy. But yeah. All right, so we did have some questions about Dribbble and Behance. These are just two sites, and you can kind of see in these thumbnails here, or these small pictures, that they're basically just places where you could kind of put images on. Like for example, if I were to go to Behance, Behance is an Adobe page, by the way. Let's see if this works. Yeah, so you could basically see in Behance that there's just a lot of graphical things. People are creating a lot of graphic designer images and things like that. You will have people creating web interfaces as well, and mobile applications as well. But a lot of it is more just kind of like what things look like. Here's more of a UX designer sort of thing here. Oops, I clicked on it. Yeah, so it's a lot of branding and looks like posters and things like that. So this is what Behance is all about. And Dribbble is pretty much just the same. Oh, this is a good one. This is a mobile application, it looks like, and you can kind of see this person's using jellyfish and some other things to kind of like do that. So it's pretty cool. That's Behance for you. And Dribbble is pretty much the same. It's just it's pink instead of blue, basically. I actually like Behance better, by the way. But all right, now this is a very important slide. It's about case studies. If you click on this, it's going to lead you to a link. And let's see. Now, these are just examples of case studies. They're not all the case studies for sure, but they're just some good ones here. And if I were to click on one, this is by Jessie Chen. Jessie Chen actually works for Lyft, and she actually was responsible for a lot of the redesign that Lyft went through in, it looks like 2016. So if you were to click into this, you can basically see the story of how that unfolded. As we mentioned before, UX design is all about telling a story. So here you could basically see the story that she's telling. She's telling the story about a workshop and all this other stuff. And you could see the overview. You could see she's going to mention a challenge here. Like, what is the challenge, or what is the problem that has to be solved? And you could kind of see um, before and after. Like, what did Lyft look like before? It looks like they didn't even have that pink color. They rebranded basically. It looks like the map looks a little bit different as well. You could see a little bit, the car images look very different for sure. And basically what they did was, you could read the entire story here of how, how that, better usage of primary color, like how they basically did that story of changing. So I think that this is one of my favorite case studies for sure. Obviously, you have tons to choose from here. And also you could basically just go to other people's profiles as well. I think that's to write good case studies. I think you definitely have to read other people's case studies just to kind of get a sense of how they do that sort of thing. This is another good one here. This one's actually pretty recent. But yeah, it's 2 parts, but it's okay. So yeah, I kind of like this one because it basically just puts out the problem immediately. Why does planning an overseas trip? Oh no, something happened. I clicked on it too much. All right, sorry about that. But yeah, like this person puts the problem up front. Why does planning an overseas trip feel like a school project? So because this is nice and big for us to see, we know what the rest of the case study is going to be about. It's going to be about how we solve this. Like, how do we solve this problem and make planning an overseas trip a little bit more enjoyable? So that's basically what this person does. And you could see statistics about different types of audience. They do surveys, they do research. Like, this is all stuff that kind of goes with that user experience, that user researcher perhaps. And then down at the bottom, as they progress through the research, then they're able to kind of create better products, basically. So this is the new design. This is how it works. They're giving nice diagrams here. This was definitely created with something like Figma or one of those programs. And that's basically it. There's a lot that really goes into it, but I think that this is a very good method of checking out. All right. Okay, so hold on a second. All right, so I'm going to come back here, and I did get another question in my private messages. So the question is, for the Q&A, or I guess this, okay. How do you think it's the best way to transition from a career in science to a career in UI UX? What skills would you say are key to land me an internship or a job? This depends on what science that you do. I definitely think that science is another good one because depending on what science you are doing, you are still testing. I think science is a lot about testing. And as if I go back a little bit, if I go back a few slides here, you'll see here that, UX design and UI design is all about testing. It's all about, making some sort of design, seeing if it works. And if it doesn't work, then trying again. And maybe changing some things, see what kind of feedback you get. I think that, in whatever type of science that you are interested in, I think that, that does have that similarity where testing is a big deal. Testing is always something that, as a scientist, you're able to kind of, see how things react with one another and then recalibrating and refiguring it out afterwards. So, I don't think that science is any worse than journalism or graphic design or whatever. I think as long as you are able to tell your story, I think that you would be fine. All right. Okay, so that's basically this. We could go back and look at more case studies in a little bit, but basically, as we near the ending sections, I definitely want to give you guys plenty of time to ask more questions as well. With about 15 or so minutes left. And basically, this is how to continue doing stuff. To continue being interested and continue working and getting better. These 3 things here, and also other things, is how you stay motivated. I can't stress enough how important it is to go to meetups. Don't learn this stuff by yourself. I think that's, it's great that you guys are here tonight. Obviously, I think that you guys are giving me an audience, which is great. But also, you're taking back a lot of knowledge, and I think that going to in-person meetups, it definitely puts you out of your comfort zone, and it forces you to kind of go there and try to talk to people about things. Maybe they're people with more experience than you, so it may be even like frustrating and a little bit intimidating. But at the same time, this is how you learn. This is how you really are able to you know get a mentor or learn something from someone else. So I would definitely suggest finding a meetup in your city, or go to some other city that does have a meetup if you can. Um, there's a lot of knowledge to be learned. The next thing is YouTube tutorials. It's a little bit closer to home. I will put some channels that I do like, AJ and Smart, and then I will get to your question, Olga. AJ and Smart and the Future, and the Future does not have an E in it, but it's just the Future without the E. Those are two of my favorite channels. There are tons of designer channels as well, but those are two that I really like, especially AJ and Smart. They're very cool. Okay, so Olga has a question about salaries, and to be honest, I think that salaries are pretty good. I think that even coming in as a junior UX designer, you are looking at 70, 80, something like that, depending on what city you're in, for sure. But you are able to, this is, I think LinkedIn in 2019 said that the UX designer, the product designer, is number 4, I believe, of the most sought after job. So data scientist was there, and some other ones, but the UX designer is definitely, it's an industry that's going to grow very much in the next decade or two. So it's going to be in demand. So learning these types of skills now actually really benefits you, and it really sets you up to be a senior designer when more people are coming in, and you are able to really take advantage of that now. The last thing is coding websites. I think that's sites like Free Code Camp and Code Academy. They do have some design focused things in there, so I would definitely say that is another really good thing that you could kind of look at. And the last thing is this link here. So this is the way to get access. This is to get in touch with someone at Thinkful, like an academic success manager, who is able to kind of like walk you through what the course has, like the curriculum. Is it something that you want to do? We won't really be talking about that now, just because there's not really too much time left, and you guys probably have a ton of questions. But it's my job to basically lead you to this link so that you can get to talk to someone else who is more knowledgeable of those sorts of things. So definitely get in touch with someone. Go follow this link, apply to it, and it's not going to ask for any sort of credit card information or anything like that. It's more just so that you are able to get in touch with someone at Thinkful. All right, you guys, awesome. Feel free to connect with me and ask whatever questions that you want. And please come to more of Thinkful's webinar series for sure. We have one every night. All right, have a fantastic evening.